I get a lot of questions about the Quilt As You Go technique that I use for my Carling Loves Cats quilted coat. So I'm going to show you the technique that I use, and what it's used for is to connect the seams of your quilted coat so that it is fully reversible, so that it's finished on the outside and on the inside. Essentially what you're doing is you're attaching two binding strips at the same time to the front and the back. So let's get into it. For this Quilt As You Go technique, I'm going to be teaching you a bias Quilt As You Go binding versus a straight edge Quilt As You Go binding. You really need to cut your binding pieces on the bias so that you can fit around this curve. If you're new to bias binding, go check out my video on bias binding before you watch this Quilt As You Go technique. It'll make a lot more sense. So I have my fabric laid out, folded on the bias, and I'm going to start cutting my binding for Quilt As You Go. So for Quilt As You Go, you're going to have a piece of binding on the front and a piece of binding on the back. The piece on the front is going to need to be 1 inch wide, and the piece on the back is 1 inch and 3/4. It'll make sense once we start sewing it. So what I like to do is I like to alternate my cuts because of how you fold on the bias and cut your strips. They're all varying lengths, but if you alternate, you get about the same amount in the end, and you need the same amount in front and back binding for the Quilt As You Go technique. So I'm going to chop off this little tiny triangle. We're going to save that just in case we need a little extra. So I'm going to cut a 1 inch piece first, and I like to refer to that as the front Quilt As You Go binding. And then the next piece I'm going to cut is 1 3/4, and that's for the back piece. And now I'm just going to alternate all the way down, cutting front 1 inch and back 1 3/4 inches. Okay, we have all of our binding pieces cut for the front and the back of the Quilt As You Go binding, 1 inch for the front, 1 3/4 for the back, and we alternated all of our cuts. So we're gonna have about the same amount of front and back binding. And now I'm gonna just start pinning the ends together so I can create one continuous binding strip. I've finished making all of my binding for my Quilt As You Go. So I have the 1-inch strip not folded, and then I have the 1 3/4 inch strip that is folded, just like you would a regular binding. This is our regular 2 1/4 inch binding. We will not be using this for Quilt As You Go. So what we're going to be doing is connecting the sleeve all the way down to the bottom of the jacket using Quilt As You Go. This is your Quilt As You Go strip. The front 1-inch strip, not folded, and then the back is the 1 3/4 inch strip folded. And I like to connect them both at the same time. So we're going to have the folded 1 3/4 raw edge on the inside of the jacket, and then we're going to have the 1-inch raw edge, each side is raw edge, on the outside of the jacket. So let me show you that again. Here's your 1 3/4 inch piece, raw edge to raw edge, and then on the front of the jacket, here's your 1-inch piece, raw edge to raw edge. And so I'm going to go down and pin this all the way down to the bottom of the jacket, and then we're going to sew it using a 1/4 inch seam. I just finished sewing on the Quilt As You Go binding, 1-inch strip on the front and 1 3/4 inch folded strip on the back or the inside. So now we're going to take the raw edge of the 1-inch strip and connect it to the other side of the jacket. So I'm going to show you how to pin it, and then we're going to go and sew that on the machine. Here's the left side of the back turned inside out, and now what you're going to do is you're going to connect the front of the 1-inch strip raw edge to the right side of the back. So it's going to look like this. And so you're just going to sew the 1-inch strip raw edge matching the raw edge of the back of the jacket. So I'm going to pin that, and then we're going to go to the machine and sew it. I just finished sewing the second side of the 1-inch strip for the Quilt As You Go. So the outside is finished. Now let me show you what the inside looks like, where the 1 3/4 inch folded binding is. So you can see how these little seams are going to tuck in. They just match right up those raw edges. They just match right up, and you're gonna take your 1 3/4 inch piece and fold it over to cover those seams. And then you just use whatever method you use to finish a binding. You can do it by hand. You can use your machine and do a decorative stitch. This gets a little tight, so you have to have a machine that has a really small, area. Or, just do this part by hand, and you can do the rest with a decorative stitch. And then it's also really helpful to have a tailor's ham to iron it down first, iron everything. It's just a little, if you Google it, it's just a little pillow that, it makes it a little bit easier to iron.